Meeting is now being recorded.
The American Planning Association Colorado chapter and the University of Colorado Denver, the Resilient Colorado Initiative. I'd like to welcome you to this workshop on why planners are critical for achieving resilience. The workshop is both an in-person session as well as a webinar, so welcome to folks that are calling in. If you are calling in, just a reminder to please mute your phone. And then for those in the rooms, if you remember to please speak into the microphone when we may have a discussion at different points in the session. The webinar is being recorded and will be available after the event, so watch what you say. No. In the wake of historic flooding in September of 2013 and the series of devastating fires over the last several years, now, as you know, is a really critical time for planners in Colorado to rethink approaches to building safer and healthier communities for the long term. We're very fortunate today to have Andy Rumbaugh join us to present and facilitate the discussion about the role of planners in promoting resilience and sustainability. Andy is an assistant professor in the Department of Planning and Design at the University of Colorado, Denver. He holds a doctorate and master's degree in city and regional planning from Cornell University. His research examines the relationships between urbanization and environmental risk, with special focus on the vulnerability of poor and marginalized groups to natural hazards and global climate change. He's especially concerned with the role that planning plays in shaping geographies of risk and resilience in cities, an interest he developed while working on neighborhood recovery plans in New Orleans following Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. Andy's current research is centered largely on cities in eastern India and the Pacific Islands. Colorado is lucky to have Andy and teams of faculty and staff working on flood recovery research and planning projects here in Colorado, and he'll talk more about that. So welcome, Andy, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. I just moved to Colorado in August of last year, and as a disaster recovery person, it was, I guess, somewhat fortunate that we had a major disaster for me, and so I actually know probably more than half of the people in the room because of the floods in September, and so it's a really great opportunity to talk about these kind of issues. So whenever Ann and Waverly asked me to come speak today, it's interesting. I have a very ambivalent relationship with resilience, and I have for like 10 years. Since I really started studying this, and I spent, as only PhD students do, I spent 4 solid years reading theories of risk, vulnerability, resilience from 1940s onwards. And so I kind of, there's a deep sense of ambivalence about whether resilience is an idea that we should be embracing or whether it's a fad that we should be somewhat ignoring. And I think I've finally come around to where I'm becoming very positive about resilience, and I hope to try to share a little bit about why that is with you today. And I think probably if there's one takeaway, and it's probably in the title, is that I think resilience is more than disaster mitigation and more than vulnerability or more than sustainability. In a lot of ways, I think planners are more central to resilience than any of those concepts, and that's why I think it's so exciting for me and for my students and for people I work with. So, okay, we're skipping that one. Okay, so as I'm sure you have maybe noticed, resilience is a little bit all over the place right now, versus even a few years ago when you would see mentions of resilience in certainly in the hazards and disasters world, sometimes in the child psychology literature, and certainly in the ecological theory, but in general, resilience was not a word that you typically saw outside of academic research circles. And then all of a sudden, within the last few years, it's everywhere, and it's really the sort of buzzwords of the moment. I just literally pulled down the first 5 or 6 of the 2.7 million search results on Google that came with resilience. And so it's everywhere. The president's talking about it. The federal government's talking about it. State agencies are talking about it. Communities are talking about it. And so today I really want to, like I said, I want to explore whether or not that's a good thing and where planners fit into that conversation. The reasons are obvious. As Ann alluded to, we don't really need to be reminded in Colorado, but we've done a tremendously good job in the last 50 years of reducing human loss of life from disasters, especially in the United States. We've done a pretty poor job of reducing the economic cost of disasters. They've actually been escalating and escalating very quickly. This is just the number of billion-dollar events in the last 25-odd years, and there's a clear trend upwards. And if you start to measure what the UN calls extensive events, those are smaller events that don't raise, they don't rise to the level of a billion-dollar event. They're much more common, though. Their costs actually add up to more than the big events that we think about. And so overall, the cost of disasters has risen tremendously over the last 30 years. And a lot of it has to do directly with the kind of things we deal with as planners, especially building things in places that experience hazards. And then, of course, there's the specter of climate change, which is there's a lot of uncertainty bound up in that, but we know it's going to have some pretty dramatic effects on our communities, and it's going to especially have dramatic effects on places like Colorado, where water is so precious, where wildfires threaten us, where floods are a major concern. We know that climate change is going to have a bunch of terrible impacts. We also don't know exactly how extensive those impacts will be. And so, again, I think resilience captures some of that uncertainty and captures some of the feeling that people have about they know that there's big challenges ahead, but they don't exactly know what they are. And I think that's really one of the reasons that distinguishes itself from hazard mitigation or other approaches that really are much more specific in what they're looking at. A lot of that has to do with the work of Ian Hollings, who's an ecologist out of the University of Chicago and a couple of other places, but he really was the first person who talked about resilience as it applies to systems, especially as it applies to natural systems. And his real interest was in studying natural systems and why some systems, even though they go through periods of strength and weakness, they persist over time versus other systems that appear to be very healthy, but suddenly, because of a shock, essentially go extinct. He was looking largely at either insect populations or bird and fish populations. And so it's a fascinating article, and really that was the starting point for which a lot of the sort of resilience thinking we're talking about today has its origins in. And he continued to write about resilience up until just a few years ago when he stopped writing, and a lot of people have carried that mantle forward. And I think what the really interesting piece about Hollings' work is he really talks about this idea of the constancy of relationships is much more important than stability. So it's much more important that whatever happens to us, that our relationships persist, than it is that we reach this point where we're always safe and nothing ever happens to us. Because his finding is basically when you become too stable, you stop learning and you stop adapting and you become very brittle. And therefore, when something happens that you're not expecting, you essentially break. And that's what he saw in all the different cases he looks at in that seminal paper, which you can view online for free. Later on, he started through his research really talking about we actually go through this, all ecological systems go through this whole cycle of adaptive change. And what's most interesting about this, and especially as I talk about the problem of bringing this into the human world, is the fact that systems tend to reach their sort of peak. They can really conserve their strength as much as possible, and then they experience these events where they basically go into these reorganization phase. They oftentimes lose big parts of their population or lose a bunch of diversity, and then it takes a while for them to adapt to a new point of point of attraction, as he calls them. And so, as I alluded to, there's some issues with bringing that into human systems. And so one of them that's most important is that, I mean, we know for 40 or 50 years of really careful research on disasters, really since the 1950s and Gilbert White's work out of Colorado, that the most vulnerable tend to be or the least well-off tend to be the most vulnerable to disasters. And that, you know, in order to solve something like a disaster, it's not about doing something related to the disaster itself. You have to solve some pretty intractable problems like poverty and marginalization and racism and those kind of things, which are, you know, if you just focus on the disaster itself or just focus on resilience, you're really never going to be able to deal with some of the more intractable, larger systematic issues that we face. Unless we're talking about resilience in a much broader, in a sense that's so widespread that it goes far beyond anything related to the environment and encapsulates all of society, which at that point I think most people would agree it becomes somewhat of it's so vague that it becomes not very useful in a real everyday sense. Probably the other issue that I really focused on that's really difficult is this metaphor of bouncing back, which is, you know, it comes from the word itself. It's a very, we think about it as being a very good metaphor, but in some ways it's quite antiquated in terms of what its thinking is, because the idea that we would want to bounce back to what we were, which just got destroyed, is not a particularly good concept, because essentially, do we want to bounce back to a system where a bunch of people were discriminated against and lived in floodplains? Do we want to bounce back to a system where we had a ton of stuff that was valuable in floodplains? It's really dealing with this idea of we're not bouncing back, instead we're sort of bouncing forward. And that's been a very difficult leap sometimes for people to think about. It's not just about absorbing shocks and surviving them. It's also about learning from them and adapting and moving forward in different ways. And then I always tell, you know, I always talk about this with my students, but it's like we also, one big part of Hollings' work was, you know, part of resilience is essentially always testing your boundaries. And so, for example, forests where they oftentimes have naturally occurring wildfires are much healthier than forests that do not. And the more we try to control fire and stop it, the the much more fire-prone they become. So there's a health to that sort of burning of the forest every so often in order to survive, the bigger system to survive. It's not very easy to burn a human system down and see what survived and test our weaknesses. It's very difficult for us to understand resilience outside of disasters. And so it's not very appealing to think we have to wait until a disaster to really understand who's weak and who's not and what we should do about it. And so that's also a really difficult part of bringing this into our own work because we don't like to think that we like the idea of stability being everyone's safe and everyone's safe from harm, and yet resilience kind of says that's not a very good idea. We should always be pushing the limits. And so for me, those are some of the bigger issues with resilience and where I start to see oftentimes the stress in applying the theory to our everyday work. But I think we're starting to work our way through all of those issues, and I think resilience is starting to take on, we're starting to redefine it in certain ways that's making it much more appropriate for the kind of work that planners do. So these are just some definitions of resilience that have come up in the last 10 years. These, they all have their roots in Holling's work and other people's work, but they also very much reflect what you all have talked about here on the board. The capacity of a system to experience shocks, the ability to prepare for, plan, absorb, recover from disaster events, the ability of a community to deal with not only adversity but reach a higher level of functioning. That's all about the adaptability part of it. And so really there's a bunch of different definitions that are being bandied about. As you probably, or if you focus at all on resilience, as I know some people on the call and here in the room have, you realize that not everyone's talking about the same thing, and there's some degree of people who are just using resilience for whatever they care about in the first place, and it's a convenient term to be used. But that being said, I do think there is some convergence going on in the world between what we mean when we talk about resilience. And so a question that always comes up, and it's a very interesting question, is so what's about the relationship between resilience and sustainability? We spent the last 20 years making sustainability a useful term, and now there's a bunch of people saying we should throw it away and talk about resilience instead. And that's an extremely frustrating thing to have happen. And it's unfortunate because there are some people who are trying to build their careers on the word resilience and are throwing out the baby with the bathwater. I do think there's some interesting differences between the two. And to go to my last slide, or the last point on this slide, I think of resilience as a part of sustainability. I mean, you can't really be sustainable if your system just, breaks down and is destroyed every few years, right? Part of sustainability has to be resilience. But I do think resilience brings its own. I think that they are very complementary, and I think we can use them together, and I think resilience brings some things to the conversation that sustainability does not. One of them is this idea of resilience of what and for who. And if we study sustainability theory, we know that one of the three legs of sustainability is equity, and yet no one ever uses it at all. Sustainability has become, and very much is used all the time and often and never addresses the kind of inequalities that we see in everyday life. And I think resilience, we have an opportunity to really make resilience partly about finding out who is most vulnerable, who's most at risk, and doing things to elevate them. And that really has, for me at least, has a social justice dimension that sustainability lost some time ago. I don't know when, probably around the time that the Kellogg Corporation started, whenever the sustainability became a profit center rather than an academic. I also think, as I said, really the second point there is, sustainability is sometimes talking about intergenerational justice, not doing things today that harm the future of other people, whereas resilience is more about the systems functioning today. We don't have a sort of intergenerational idea of resilience, at least not on a sort of everyday operational level. I hope that's not always the case, but that also very much distinguishes them. And then I think at the end of the day, one of the most interesting questions about resilience, and I hope we come back to this at the end of the talk, is at what scale should we be judging resilience? Is it about every single person? If you suffer during a disaster, is the whole system not resilient, or is it at a very big level? As long as our city survives, we're resilient. I think that level, the scale question, we can't often get to with sustainability. But I'd like to come back to that during the discussion because I think it's really interesting, especially those of you who've worked with sustainability for a long time, to see how you're incorporating resilience thinking into your work, or if you think it's not as useful. This is also a really nice little article, Can Cities Be Resilient and Sustainable at the Same Time? It's from Slate magazine, but it's one of their they have several sort of almost like think tank journalist centers, and it's from there. But it's a nice short piece, but it kind of lays out some of both the relationships but also the tensions between the two terms.
Can you say more about the intergenerational piece? I would think resiliency, if you're looking at it's going to be better in the long term, how is that not intergenerational?
The question was talking a little bit more about this idea of intergenerational justice and why maybe, when we think of resilience at large, we think of the long term, why that doesn't speak to the justice long term. I think that's a good question. I think for me, at least, and this is more like the everyday discussions of resilience, when I read about resilience and what people are doing in terms of policies related to resilience, it's oftentimes very much about the here and now and current conditions and people living in those communities. You're right, there's this sort of larger notion of creating safer communities, and that's good for all, but it doesn't speak to that direct relationship between what I do harms people in the future. You don't see resilience very often. Like, sustainability is often used as a moral judgment on somebody. Like, because you're throwing trash on the ground, that's not sustainable for others. Like, you're doing something wrong. You don't see people very often going to somebody in a floodplain and saying, because you live here, you're screwing future generations to be safe. And I think that's the difference. It doesn't have that same moral. I wish it would in some ways, but it's not a very effective, especially when we talk about things like land use, it's not a very effective. The moral argument doesn't work very often, especially in the United States. It's oftentimes more of a legal and a safety and those things. At least that was my thinking when I wrote that. But we can come back to it. And if you disagree with me, I'd love to have you critique my thoughts too, because that would be really useful. Okay, so that leads to a big question. Why should we even deal with resilience? Why, if the term itself has been sort of quickly taken over by a lot of people. I wrote down this really great quote from Robert Reich. He was talking. I heard this. He was talking about globalization, but he said globalization is one of those words that have gone from obscurity to meaningless without any intervening period of coherence. And that's sort of where resilience is at this. We're starting to go that direction. It feels like maybe we're losing the middle, and we're kind of moving from it being a word nobody knew to a word that everybody's using, and no one ever took a moment to agree what it meant. So why should we rescue a term like that? Why not just let it become a fad that burns out after a couple of years? I think it's actually, I think we should save it, and I think planners should save it especially, and I think we should start using it a lot more, and we should sort of stake our ground on resilience. If nothing else, for me, because if you think about the entire lexicon of disasters and climate change, think about disaster management, think about disaster risk reduction, think about vulnerability. We have this entire lexicon of negative words. And it's a pretty remarkable thing. I mean, we don't have a department of sickness. We have a department of public health. We don't have a department of, like, economic depression. We have a department of, we use positive words for everything else, but when it comes to disasters, everything we talk about is negative, and it's very, and that is the one change. I mean, I've interviewed, I bet, over 1,000 households in the last 10 years about disasters and risk and climate change. Nobody ever, wants to talk about their vulnerability, right? You have to sort of dig it out of them, and you're asking all these proxy questions, all that. Suddenly with resilience, people are talking about resilience in a positive way. They're talking about our resilience. They don't talk about our vulnerability and our risk, because that's an academic term, it's a policy term. But they talk about our resilience. And communities are grabbing onto this term and really it inspires people, and it's a positive term, and it's something we can build on. And I mean, I think at the end of the day, as planners, we don't want to be imposing resilience on people. We want communities to be running so fast towards it that we're just trying to chase them and help them and support them and do whatever we can. And so I think that alone, the positivity of it is a really inspiring thing, and I think that we should take advantage of that, and I think we should use it for that reason. I mean, I think there's other reasons as well, especially with this idea of uncertainty, and I think that's a big piece of resilience is trying to deal with unexpected things, and I think that fits very well with people's understanding of what's coming with climate change. But overall, I think the positive aspects of resilience is really why we should try to rescue it from the Kellogg Corporation or whoever picks it up. Okay, so this is my definition of resilience, or the characteristics that I came up with for this talk. The 6 characteristics that I think are define or characterize a resilient community. I think they anticipate, and these are this is not like I'm a genius. I came up with these are very, like you read these other places too. They anticipate shocks and stresses, basically, and they take meaningful actions to address them. So they assess risk and they do something about it. They build redundancy into their systems, whether it's human systems or infrastructure systems, and that prevent catastrophic failures. So if one thing goes down, it doesn't take out the whole place. They promote diversity by continually seeking to include a wide range of publics, whatever that means, however you define public, in their decision-making process. They're always trying to expand the scope of participation, not lessen it. They try to remain flexible to adapt to unexpected shocks. They build excess capacity that they can marshal in a time of a disaster. They're not they're not always running on a lean and mean machine. They have some flexibility or some capacity they can rely on. And then the last, and what I also think is a really very interesting and powerful piece, is this idea that they continually learn. They're always trying to create meaningful feedback loops. Even during non-disaster times, they're always trying to learn and trying to adapt. And I think that's something really powerful about resilient communities. And so what I'd like to do now is I'm going to go through each of those 6 characteristics and give you an example of what I think is a community that in some ways embodies that aspect. And I have a couple examples. So first one, anticipate shocks and they act. I mean, Charlotte-Mecklenburg County is a really good example of that through their floodplain management program. This is a place that is extremely fast-growing and extremely flood-prone. Some of you might be familiar with it already. This is an area that also is not known for its extremely progressive politics, which is a theme I think you'll see running throughout my examples. I'm more fascinated by places where it's hard to do things than I am with places where it's more easy to do things. I mean, of course, Charlotte's more progressive than maybe the state around it, but still, this as a whole, the environment is not necessarily where you'd expect these kind of things to arise. But in their flood management program, they basically they create and maintain their own local floodplain maps that are much more they call the FEMA maps traditional maps, and they call their own community maps. And basically, their community maps anticipate the full build-out of their community and what that'll look like in terms of floods, and then they regulate to that. So they're looking 50 years ahead, saying what happens when this all builds out, how will that impact floodplains, and then they regulate to that standard, not to the current standard. And as a result, they're basically acquiring and regulating a whole lot more. Their floodplain is much wider than it would be otherwise. And they're already seeing, I mean, huge returns on the investment. They've already sort of calculated that, $250,000 to produce the initial map saved over $16 million in terms of property loss. They've created a targeted buyout program that they've really carefully applied in terms of they've strategically avoided federal programs, including the 404 buyout program, which a lot of you are familiar with right now. They raised their own money to do it, and then they've been strategically buying out properties as people die or they want to sell them. These are all willing sellers. There's no force, and as a result, they've acquired huge amounts of land along rivers and streams and corridors and other flood-prone places and turned them into economic assets. And as a result, they're losing a lot less economic value during flood events. They've also done some really great integrative work with their state. They have the Carolina Integrated Sciences and Assessment Program, which basically provides the scientific data they need to develop these maps. And so I think it's still the only state in the country that develops and maintains their own floodplain maps. But it's a really good example of sort of anticipating the future and then regulating to that, especially and building community consensus around that's what we should be doing. This is not a program that's a flash in the pan. It's lasted across several administrations, and it's a popular program overall, not only within the city of Charlotte, but also within Mecklenburg County. Another example of anticipating shocks is East Lens Floodplain Restoration Project. As you might tell throughout this whole talk, I focus on floods as my research. So Anne actually said, can you talk about wildfires? I was like, not really. The last 3 places I've lived were Hawaii, Ithaca, New York, and Calcutta, India, which none of those are known for its wildfires. So I'd be really interested. So most of my examples are, I will admit, floods and coastal floods, but I would love to hear how some of these lessons might be applied to wildfires. The East Lens Floodplain Restoration Project was a really similar project in Oregon and Portland. Again, it's this idea that they had this, and this one was very familiar to me because I used to live in the neighborhood, but it's not the neighborhood that was bought out, but the adjacent neighborhood. But basically, the Johnson Creek area would flood regularly, and this was more nuisance flooding. It wasn't catastrophic flooding, but the city took a very proactive role in developing a fund to do a willing sellers program. And in relatively short order, over 15 years, they actually bought out 68 acres worth of property and turned it into a natural floodplain area, including several miles of parks and open space, trail system, et cetera. In that case, they used CDBG money. They used some hazard mitigation grant program money. They also levied a special stormwater fund for the purpose. And as a result, they've seen, again, significant reductions in flood losses. These are both really, anyone who does floodplain management, these kind of stories will be very familiar. But again, it's that proactive nature of assessing risk, understanding that the continuing development in that area would lead to worse and worse floods, not only for East Lens, but also for the whole Johnson Creek watershed, and therefore creating some pretty proactive programs to start dealing with those. that were not at all, they did not rely on a catastrophic event to get people moved. They were able to do it relatively under blue skies. And there's a little picture of the results. And this is, like I said, in pretty short order. It was over 60 properties that were bought out in a pretty large area. But now it's not only a good recreation area, but they also use it quite a bit for education, and they do a lot of sort of elementary schools come in and do plantings and learn about floodplain management. So they've kind of linked in the learning aspect to it as well. I think I'm going to skip the video just because of the audio issues. What do you think? Okay. There is a nice little video. It's like 2 minutes about a celebration of it where they talk a little bit about it. So you should go, these slides will be up online. You should go look at it later. But I'm going to go ahead and skip past it. Okay, so building redundancy into systems. I think the Cannon Beach, Oregon example is another really interesting. And this is just an example of a bigger national movement towards pre-disaster recovery planning. But the Oregon and the Cannon Beach pre-disaster recovery plan is a really interesting example of where again, a town that has a relatively low risk but relatively low probability but very high risk of the next big Cascadia subduction, earthquake, tsunami could wipe out a large number of communities along the Oregon coast. But that doesn't happen very often, and so it's not like they were doing this as a result of some disaster. They did this in anticipation of a pretty low probability event. But they were able to basically design a program where they started bringing together different agencies, different actors, different institutions, get them into a room together and talk about some scenarios where they would have a major tsunami, and think about through not only their infrastructure systems, not only through their how different agencies respond, roles and responsibilities. They also thought through their budgeting process, and they really thought about what should we be doing better right now so that when this does happen, we're in a better spot. And this is a process that was, it was mediated by the Oregon Natural Hazards Workshop, but the result was that they had a pretty, there was a whole lot of host of actions that resulted from this process, where you have an example of agencies talking to one another, individuals talking to one another, that wasn't happening prior, probably wouldn't be happening without this encouragement, and planners were at the center of it because they're the ones who actually convened it and they're the ones who facilitated the conversations. And this idea of doing pre-disaster recovery planning, I think, is something that all the communities in Colorado should think about doing, and especially as I'll talk about at the end of the talk, there's some resources coming online pretty soon here about where you can have free community workshops where somebody will come and facilitate the same kind of scenario where they create a scenario that's somewhat likely in your community, a major wildfire, a major flood, and then you start thinking through how would we respond, where would we really be hurting, and what could we do in the short, in the meantime to make ourselves better prepared. I think that that's a trend that we should really be embracing, and again, planners are kind of at the center of that kind of action. Any questions at this point? Before I just natter on for an hour straight.
I had a quick question going back to the Charlotte example.
Sure.
And I'm just curious, the point that you made about why they strategically chose not to use federal funds for the buyout.
Yep.
Is that something that I'm just curious?
I think there were 3 reasons, if I remember correctly. One is that the funds themselves were so bureaucratically managed that they would not allow them to really make the purchases at the opportune moment. It would be, once somebody decided they want to sell, then you'd have to enter this decades-long, years-long process of assessing it, evaluating it, getting through, approved. They wanted to be able to act on things when they came up. And so when the house came on the market at fair market price, they wanted to be able to purchase it immediately. I think the other reason, and this is from a conversation I had, I can't remember if I read it, I think it was from a conversation. Somebody said, in general, when a program has a federal stamp on it, sometimes it's less popular than when it's a city, county, local. And I think that's a similar, you hear that some other places too, that, sometimes the reputation of something relies on it being a local sort of bottom-up thing, and that was part of it as well, is that people liked the idea of it was an accountable local, it wasn't the federal government coming in and buying stuff, it was the city doing it. So, but I think the mismatch between the timing was the biggest driver of that.
Question kind of a follow-up on that is the political will around doing pre-disaster planning, and so a couple of the communities were actually willing to spend money on some things to preempt some disasters.
pre-disaster recovery planning. Which
So,
is,
like, how are they?
oh, sure.
What were the communities doing to try to get there? I mean, I think maybe you already answered that saying that it was coming from the community level, so that was kind of forcing the tools to be put in place to be able to do some investment around that.
Right.
But like, what is? Just curious about that because it seems like obviously after a disaster, everybody's like, oh my god, we have to, change things, but.
So the question is basically, it's difficult to get communities to want to do pre-disaster recovery planning. How did Cannon Beach?
Yeah. I mean,
how were they able to
motivate a community and a local government to try to do that kind of pre-disaster planning? Because it's kind of speculative, right? And you don't want to just do fear mongering. You want to be smart about it, and then you have to get public dollars into that planning.
Right.
So.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and I think that I don't think it's fear mongering in the sense that it's not like it's not like an asteroid strike scenario. It is a scenario that's if you live in the Northwest, especially along the coast, that is a significant. I do think that the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami had a role to play. I think people saw that happen, and even though it didn't affect them directly, they did see this could happen to us if there was a large enough event, and I think that really helped. I think you're right. In most of these cases, the presence of a disaster is always going to spur communities much more than the absence of it. But I do think that more and more, the more we can witness other disasters, the more we can speak intelligently about other events, the more we can relate what happens in one place to another. I think we will start. I think this is that whole what we're seeing the beginning of a shift towards more of a resilience mindset. Disaster mitigation. A lot of this is hazard mitigation work, but that kind of exists within pretty relatively minor or small silos, narrow silos. Even, whenever you look at all disaster mitigation plans nationwide, Phil Burke and Gavin Smith and this group in North Carolina just analyzed all of them nationwide since 2000, since the Hazard Mitigation Act was passed, and they found that less than 5% were done by planners. Like 90% or more were done by emergency managers who, when you think about hazard mitigation plans, a lot of it's about land use and a lot of it's about housing. So there's already this idea that, disaster mitigation belongs in this relatively small area, whereas resilience is a much broader idea, and I think if we can harness that, we can present things in a way that communities. But that's a really interesting challenge, and maybe as those resources come out, and as we start trying to push communities that haven't experienced a disaster recently to think about those, we'll see what happens. But yeah. Okay. So the next example I had is Tulsa, Oklahoma, which any of you in floodplain management will have probably heard a lot about Tulsa. Those of you who have not, as you might imagine, Tulsa is in Oklahoma is a relatively conservative city. I put this quote up here because I think it encapsulates kind of a little bit about Tulsa. We live in a frontier where a man has the right to do with what he wishes with his land. And so, it's a place where you don't necessarily expect the kind of floodplain management they're doing to have not only sprung up, but also sprung up from the bottom up and become probably the single most successful floodplain management program in the United States in terms of prevented loss, but also in terms of economic gain from it. And so Tulsa, to give you a little bit of background, Tulsa has the Arkansas River, major flood events in 1908, 1920, 1923, 1928, and I have ... because you can literally go from there all the way through the 70s, and every 2 to 3 years, especially as Tulsa continued to grow and urbanize in the floodplain, they were having major flood events constantly. But the Memorial Day flood in 1984 was really the turning point. They had a pretty heavy loss of life for a riverine flood event. They also had really heavy damage, and they had some citizen action directly on Town Hall. And so the newly elected mayor, this was, I think, 14 days after the flood, or before the flood, they were elected. He basically created this private citizen-led initiative to create a new floodplain program, which, again, is something that really distinguishes the Tulsa story from other floodplain management stories, in that they took a completely different tack in terms of understanding what would be successful locally. A top-down program was not going to work, and something that was purely public was not going to work. They needed a strong private voices involved. But they effectively empowered this group of local citizens to start thinking about a new floodplain management system, and they brought in a bunch of outside folks like Gilbert White from Colorado, went to Tulsa for over a year, I think, and advised them on non-structural flood control. And as a result, they did a really aggressive public education campaign to get people to think more clearly about floodplain management and why private property rights within floodplains should not trump all decisions, and there should be this argument for getting people out of harm's way. They also created a stormwater management system. They convinced the city to levy a utility fee, which again is kind of unthinkable in a lot of jurisdictions. They would actually raise taxes, but they talked about specifically to avoid the fickle political winds with funding, and that $4 per month fee on every household is used exclusively 100% for floodplain management and for stormwater management. They similar to Charlotte, they enforce a floodplain regulation to what they call ultimate watershed urbanization, where they model out the next 25, 50 years of growth and regulate to that. And as a result, they have not had a major flood in 25 years. It's probably the single best example we have of a large city doing something that has literally reduced the losses from extensive and every few years to they have not had a major event in a long time.
How do they regulate?
So when they do their floodplain regulations, so similar to Charlotte, they have a separate set of floodplain maps that they have. So they have the minimum NFIP requirements, but then on top of that, they create there's a local ordinance that creates I think they have 6 different floodplain permits that they issue, but each one carries its own designation within the insurance program. And so they regulate out to, again, this sort of ultimate urbanization, which I think is a 25-year growth model at this point. It started out as a 50-year growth model. I think it's somewhere between 1.5 and 2 feet above minimum NFIP. And the interesting thing about it is especially the sort of horizontal extent from the floodway is more like 25% wider than what you would have with just the minimum NFIP. So they're regulating a whole lot of property owners who would not, if they just stuck to NFIP, they would not be involved. So again, you can imagine the political will it's taken not only to regulate to that, but also to maintain that across now many different administrations, different political winds. They've been able to maintain this. So again, it's a really good, and this all happened, again, starting with a small number of citizens who looked around the country, looked for best practices, and then created a version of it that would work in their community and really pushed it. And there's a lot written about it. That's a really nice thing about Tulsa. There's books written about it. You can go read about their program, but it's a pretty interesting story. And as I'll allude to later, one of the big stories from Tulsa is they constantly and continually focused on the positive benefits of doing it. They created a really great 50 miles of trails and corridor system that has huge economic value for the city and for the region. They have an entire integrated park system that they never had before, which people who live there love. They had an extremely aggressive flood channel bank cleanup that reduced flood risk by a lot by stopping blockages, but it also beautified and made the river a place people wanted to go. And then probably the most, they took the community rating system program and went wild with it, and now I think they're the third. They were for a long time the #1 highest rated city, but now they're #3, but they're a Class 2, which is, and it's a 40% reduction in NFIP premiums for all people, participating households. So, I mean, the huge savings for the household that they can talk about, huge environmental benefits they can talk about, huge recreational benefits. They really focused on that aspect of it, not the flood mitigation or risk reduction. They focus on the positive aspects of it, and I think that I'll come back to that later, but for me that's one of the biggest stories about resilience is constantly focusing on, similar to the triple bottom line we talk about with sustainability, always focusing on what speaks to people, and usually it's benefits in the short and medium term, not this abstract idea of flood safety. Okay, so to go somewhere that maybe, has anyone here been to American Samoa? No? Okay, so American Samoa, I gave you, even made a little map. It's a U.S. territory. It's way out in the Pacific, out west. It's pretty close to the Micronesia. It's pretty close to New Zealand. It's a territory of about 40,000 people, but it's part of the United States. It's under FEMA Region 10 in the west, and they experienced a pretty significant. Oh no. Is it 9? I should know this since I worked with them for the last 2 years. But so this is a tsunami event that they had in 2009, which was along the Tonga Trench. But basically, a large series of earthquakes within seconds of one another created a pretty large tsunami event in the entire region that affected primarily Tonga, Samoa, and American Samoa. And so along coastal Samoa, you had flood heights or tsunami wave heights of up to 30 feet. you had pretty widespread devastation around the entire island. If you know volcanic islands, you know that basically you have about 200 or 300 yards of developable land, and then you have a mountain. And so most of the population is concentrated on the ring around the outside of American Samoa. And so when the tsunami hit, and it hit, if you look at this visualization, you see that at the very bottom left, you can see the number of minutes. They had right around 14 minutes between the time of the earthquake and when the first tsunami waves hit the island. And so from 14 to about 25, they were getting repeat series of waves from this tsunami. And so it was a very little time to respond. They had not had a tsunami in over 150 years that was of note that people would remember. People there actually talked a lot about how they'd never had a tsunami in their history, even though they had. And so it was a very unexpected event. Remarkably, though, they had loss of life that was under 20 people, which is a pretty phenomenal outcome of all this. And so a lot of what our research, we were involved for a couple of years in recovery at a village level there, and working with FEMA, working with the territorial government, working with the village community to do resilience planning. And for us, what we really started focusing on is this idea of how they were able to basically create this capacity from the institutions they already had. And so the thing to know about American Samoa that makes it very different than a lot of communities is that they have, by constitution, they have both a territorial government that very much looks like our state government and our local government, but alongside of that and in parallel to it, they have an entire traditional system of governance that stretches back many thousands of years. And this, within the villages, within the local communities, the tribal system of management is the one that actually has the force of law. And so the territorial government can't do anything at the local level without the aid and consent of the village chiefs, and especially the high-talking chiefs and the other folks there. It's not important that you understand the full how American Samoan villages operate, but what is important is this idea of how they actually harness these institutions that were already in place to create what I think is the resilience that saved probably hundreds of lives during the tsunami. And so this is a quote from one of the talking chiefs in the villages talking about, he'd been hearing a lot, after all disasters, tons of people came into American Samoa. All the religious organizations came in, FEMA came in, NOAA came in, all the federal agencies came in, and a lot of people were talking about resilience. And he was basically saying, we have this whole village system set up, and we've had it for many thousands of years. We have people who take care of one another. We know how to evacuate people. We know how to get people from one place to another. We have all of this sort of system for caring for people. It's all in place, and that's what you call resilience, and we already have it at a village level. And so what they talked a lot about was basically that there's these two particular organizations within the village. It's the Aumunga and the Aluma. The Aumunga are like what they call in Samoa, they call the hands and the feet of the village, whereas the chief is the brain. The hands and the feet are the young men who basically traditionally they fought, but nowadays they guard the village, they provide all the security, they provide they do a lot of sort of the heavy labor. They do a lot of the farming work. But they also, during a time of a disaster, they were the ones who immediately ran into the tsunami and rescued people, not away from it and waited for emergency services to come in. And so this is, again, part of the sort of everyday upbringing of that particular group of young men is their sort of duty to their village, and they acted on it immediately. Similarly, the group of women who traditionally take care of visitors within Samoan culture, the Aluma, they were the ones who provided, basically fed people, clothed people, got everyone together. This all happened, again, this is an island that's about a 6-hour flight from Hawaii, which is a 6-hour flight from San Francisco. And so this happened in the middle of nowhere. It took a while for people to get there. This was all happening for days after the tsunami, and this is a reason why you had, again, such a low loss of life. Even though you had everyone living right on the coast, and even though American Samoa is the largest problem with obesity in the world, you don't exactly have people who are afoot running up the hills. They had a tremendous system in place that saved a lot of people. For me, and for us here in this room in Colorado, where we don't have a traditional government or a traditional village government system, is the fact is that they identified this capacity they had anyway. It's something people do. It's part of their culture. It's part of their tradition. And then they have now leveraged it for resilience. They have gotten special funds to do specific training. They recognized afterwards they could have saved, I think it was 4 more lives if the young men had been trained in CPR, which they were not. And so now they've been providing CPR training. They've done emergency. They basically, instead of having some person in the middle of the capital in Pongo Pongo in charge of all the emergency supplies, they've now distributed them across the island, and each village, the clan that's in charge of the village is now in charge of the emergency supplies. They've done all these little things to leverage these institutions they already have. They didn't cost a lot of money, but they've what we think will dramatically improve their resilience to future hurricanes and tsunami events, even more so than they already were resilient. So I think for me, what's inspiring about that is whenever I work with different communities, I always think there's things about communities there's that capacity in a lot of communities, and oftentimes it's not matched at all with the goals of resilience. I think trying to figure out how to match those up, preferably not during a tsunami, is the goals of planners. What we should be doing is we should be really recognizing those strengths and trying to build on them, and recognizing what resources we need to bring to bear to make those strengths really be effective with this kind of work. I can talk a lot more about. I love American Samoa. So if you want to talk about that later, I'd be happy to talk more about their experience. All right, so in terms of always learning, this idea of always learning, I have a couple examples here. This is one I can talk about our work at University of Colorado, so I can brag about us. After the flood, we basically had a whole bunch of students, we had a whole bunch of faculty in our college all say we should be doing something as a state university. We're the only planning program in Colorado. We should be doing something to directly engage with the flood recovery. And so we launched this thing called Resilient Colorado. It's effectively a combination of three things. We're teaching courses where our students are directly engaging with the town of Lyons in their recovery. This last fall, several students in this room are in those classes, helped Lyons to develop their recovery plan. Students right now in my class are doing, helping them to develop a public engagement plan around housing and some housing alternatives options. In the fall, we're going to have 5 different graduate courses all focused on Lyons in different architecture, landscape, planning, geography, GIS. It's this idea that we're training the future generations of professionals in the state. We should, while they have an opportunity to learn a lot about resilience, they should be learning about it, and hopefully they'll carry that forward. I'm not expecting all my students to go work for FEMA or go work for the state, but they carry that experience forward, and hopefully we'll be making some decisions in the future that will make communities more resilient. We're also doing the kind of research and service that you would also expect in terms of trying to provide good information to the state and also be of service as faculty members. But again, this idea of always learning, it's about leveraging the institutions we already have. We have this amazing state university system. We're servants of the state the same as any other state employee is. We're here for the benefit of Colorado communities. We hope that our role in all of this will be one that's positive and valuable, and I think any community should be leveraging those kind of institutions better and really creating the relationships that will be able to do some meaningful work. I think the benefit is pretty clear in the sense that communities can expect to hopefully get some good work and identify some students they can hire later on, and then I think the students, I hope, take something away from it they might not have taken from a hypothetical exercise or another plan that gets kind of thrown on the shelf because some students, they're doing meaningful work, and I think it matters to them. And I think that's a really important piece of resilience is really that continual learning has to happen, and it can't just happen in policies and in the field. If it happens at the sort of educational level where as part of your training you're learning about these things, I think it's a more effective and longer lasting learning loop than sometimes trying to learn something in the immediate moment of things. Another good example is the Resilient Neighbors Network, which is just launched this last year by the Natural Hazards Mitigation Association. I probably got that wrong. Darren Punchard's group? Yeah, okay. Yeah, so they have this it's a really interesting group of 9 or 10 different charter communities, including Tulsa. I think Tulsa is where it kind of sprung up from. But again, it's a peer-to-peer community sharing network that they're sort of sharing stories about grassroots resilience. They're sharing resources. They're mutually applying for different kinds of funding. They're reaching out together to national resources that they might use as a collective. It's a really interesting example. It's yet to prove much, there's not much evidence of it, but I think it's a good example, again, of communities taking the time to reach out and to actually to try to build these networks ahead of disasters so that they can learn some things, make some changes, but also rely on them whenever bad things do happen. Again, I don't think it's not surprising that there's a lot of planners at the center of this because they think about this idea. I think learning and sharing is pretty natural to what we do as planners. Okay, I'm going to skip that slide. I'm realizing I'm already talking through my time, so I'm going to skip that one slide and go on with that. And so I just want to talk a few, again, return to a few of the problems of it. I think this speaks right to Olivia's point that you made earlier about communities not necessarily, in the absence of a big event, not wanting to just on their own proactively do disaster planning. I think that's the same point that David Campanella and Gottschalk were talking about. It's sort of like physical fitness. You have to resilience is kind of this everyday practice that you have to do, and you have to exercise. And the results of it for a community, especially for a community with limited resources and limited staff capacity, you don't see the results of resilience work immediately. You kind of have to wait until the next big event to really judge whether it was successful, and that's not a very satisfying. It's not like building something or putting your name on something. You know, it's a very difficult thing sometimes to maybe get across to people, and I think that's probably the central challenge for planners. We probably have a grace period here in Colorado for a couple of years where people are going to be really focused on this, but what do we do when people start to the disaster times are a bit of a memory and they are focusing on more immediate things? How do we keep that discussion going? I think that's probably the challenge is that longevity, and I think that we don't really have a whole lot of good answers for that, but I think we can try to start building it into the institutions in a way that becomes second nature rather than this thing we're always trying to impose. And so I think at the end of the day, to wrap up a little bit, I think that you know, there are some of these principles that we can think about in terms of not just trying to convince people, oh, resilience, this idea of resilience is a really good idea. We can actually shift the way we do things a little bit, which whether or not we call it resilience, I think puts us more in a mindset and an orientation to do the kind of things that lead to resilient outcomes. It's this idea of shifting from reactive to anticipatory, things like pre-disaster recovery planning. We have to be much more intentional about trying to anticipate rather than always just be reacting. I think we're starting to get better at that, but I think it's still a very difficult thing sometimes for communities to look at is how do we set time aside to anticipate rather than just responding to what's happening on a day-to-day basis. A big one is flattening bureaucracies, which is I don't think we're having much success with that so far, but this idea of flexible and adaptive governance is a huge part of resilience theory. Resilient systems tend to be relatively flat, have a lot of communication between, and they don't have these big stovepipes everywhere. And we've been talking about this for 5,000 years. I'm sure since the beginning of bureaucracy. I'm sure Max Weber was talking about this. Stovepipes are a killer for resilience because they effectively create little fiefdoms, and it's very difficult to work between them. And again, planners, hopefully, we're one of the few, I think, professionals that try to work between agencies in a way. I just was at the Natural Hazards Workshop, and somebody from the Nature Conservatory was talking about they're managing this huge thing out in the Pacific called the IPDR3 thing. Basically, it's a big disaster risk. It's the U.S. military. It's the University of Hawaii. It's all these federal agencies, NOAA, FEMA, but they talked about ecosystem management, where you have to manage these sea of egos, and you have to try to figure out. And that's a big part of their biggest challenge is managing the ecosystem. And it's to me, I think that's a big part of this. Is people have silos come along with big egos, and they come along with this is our territory and this is what we do, and that's very antithetical to resilience thinking. I think embracing history as a guide for future planning is a big part of this. We're starting to learn to love history a little bit more. You have a disaster, and then you go back and you're like, this happened 50 years ago, and people are like, really? History is a huge part of resilience because we can learn a lot from what happened in the past and in some ways plan towards the past. We can, if Town of Lyons had studied their flood in 1894, they would know that the entire confluence area got wiped out. And honestly, it's hard to say that, but again, history is part of this, and I think incorporating history more into our work is a really a principle we should take on in terms of resilience. We should really think about resilience as both a noun and a verb, and I think that's important. It's not for me, resilience is where do you judge something? Oh, that is resilient. Really, the only time you can do that is during the disaster, and again, like I said, that's pretty unsatisfying. It has to be a verb. There has to be this practice of resilience that we just kind of trust will lead to better outcomes, and I think a lot of this is about that. It's being more flexible, craving more learning, interacting with more people, pulling in more stakeholders. All of that is a sort of act of resilience. It's the verb of resilience, and I think that that's in a lot of ways more important because the noun, the outcome, a resilient community, it's hard to judge. We don't get it tested very often, and when unexpected things happen, sometimes we'll fail at that mark, and it doesn't mean we shouldn't continue to strive towards it. And then finally, for me, this idea of returning to planning as an advocate, as a sort of building better communities, I think there's a sort of fierce advocacy that came along with planning in the 70s, and then there's been somewhat of a decline in that, and people have criticized that, and I really think, for me, I think the role of the planner as an advocate for resilient communities is important, and I think for those of us who are oriented that direction more so than some of the more everyday functions of planning, like permitting or doing GIS. The people who really want to advocate for ideas, I think resilience is that's a principle that they should take on, and because they can really become an advocate for a resilient community, I think in the end is a much better community, and planners can advocate for that. And some of the ways, and this is just a way of starting a discussion, but some of the ways that we can really focus on resilience as a planning strategy, like I said, always focus on benefits, constantly focusing on what resonates most strongly in communities. Some communities want nothing to know, they don't want to know anything about social equity or disaster mitigation, but certain things speak to them that still contribute to resilience, things like economic value or things like property value. All of those things, building really flood-safe communities, for example, you tend to have everyone is happy in the end. Property value goes up, economic value is there, businesses can actually be fairly confident that they're not going to lose everything at some point and lose all their revenues because of the town's roads are shut down. There's a lot of knock-on benefits, and most people, except for people at the very extreme, most people can come on board with some kind of benefit that's related to resilience. We definitely have to take advantage of these windows of opportunity like we're in right now. That's a really, I wish it weren't that way, but we should. If anytime they happen, we need to jump on them and use, there's a bunch of towns in Colorado all of a sudden talking about resilience that never were before and probably won't be for a while. So we should take advantage of that and get in there and be part of that, and as planners be injecting the best knowledge, resources, whatever we can to make that process successful. Especially some of the smaller towns where this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to have these conversations about things we care about. And then I think we should always be telling stories about resilient communities. I think at the end of the day, people respond to storytelling more than they do to data or whatever else. And telling good stories about places and what it did for them, I think at the end of the day is something, again, we can do in our own professional practice. Okay, so and I'm going to switch up the order a little bit. I'm going to talk through these resources real quick and then go to these discussion questions. Okay, so I just wanted to point out a few what I think are really good resilience resources that have popped up recently. I don't think I mentioned it earlier, but I think data and the data revolution and the revolution of technology actually has such enormous potential for this kind of work that I think that this is part of it. But the resources that are available now are just insane. This is the Great Lakes Coastal Resilience Planning Guide, which, again, not every bit of it because it's coastal areas. It doesn't all apply to us here, but there's fantastic planning tools in there. There's great case studies. There's great resource linkages. One of the things I really like about it is the local studies that they do there. They really have documented carefully some of how local communities have built up some in terms of not only sea level rise, but also thinking about in the Great Lakes region, thinking about things like fish kills and other sort of major impacts on the sort of economy of Great Lakes communities. The National Disaster Preparedness Training Center out in Hawaii, they offer free training, which is, if you request it, they'll bring it to your community. They have a really good course on social media and disaster management. They're getting ready, like I said, to launch a complete training on pre-disaster recovery planning for local planners and leaders. That'll involve not only an online component, but then an in-the-class workshop that has a scenario, and you kind of bring together the different leaders in the community. That's all offered for free. That should be rolling out later this year. And hopefully we'll have some folks involved here in Colorado in developing it or sort of rolling it out as a test case. I think we're going to try to roll it out here as one of the test states. But if your community might be receptive to that, you can always go online and request trainings from NDPCC. And again, it's no cost to you, and they offer AIA and AICP credits. So some of you might be here for that. The Louisiana Resiliency Assistance Program, LARP, they have a really great website that has a whole bunch of really good training resources, but also funding resources. They point out a lot of foundation money that might be applicable to the kind of work you're saying, oh, this would be a really great resilience project, but it costs 20 grand. They have a bunch of really good foundation resources on there you might think about, national foundations you might not know about, the sort of the ones that fly under the radar of Rockefeller and Ford and the big ones. They also have a really good series of case studies on different communities around Louisiana, but also around the United States that have done really sort of progressive things with relationship to land use planning, floodplain management, those kind of things. And then last, this is a purely hazard mitigation planning type, but it just came out, and I think I'm going to use it in my class next year because it's so good. But this is that group in North Carolina that they've literally created a step-by-step. There's like 8 tasks
It's actually FEMA mitigation planning guide. They just put it online.
Oh, good. Okay, so it's FEMA. There's FEMA all over the place. Yeah.
It's a big, like, verbatim.
Oh, wow. I did not realize that. Well, it's really good. So maybe it's a more approachable way of using FEMA's hazard mitigation planning program. But, yeah, it's a pretty nice, and the way they add in case studies and they add in some different sort of peer-to-peer learning pieces of it.
I wish it was a little more clear that
Well, you should relate this back to FEMA. What's that? But it's a great resource. And so you should also use the FEMA hazard mitigation planning guide. Right, the handbook. Okay, so to wrap up what I think, my sort of going back to the initial question of the talk, why should planners, why are they critical for achieving resilience? Like through all these different examples and all the definitions I give, I really think that planners are probably among a lot of different professions we're situated to really to help build this idea of resilience. I think as a sort of second nature to what planning does, we anticipate the future and we try to do things about it, which is a big part of resilience. We tend not to react. We tend to anticipate. I think planners are pretty adept with when they have the right tools and they have the right approaches, especially if they get out in the community and actually get to learn the people they're working with. They tend to be able to identify weaknesses pretty clearly, I think, and are able to bring in the kind of resources to address weaknesses. And again, I think for planners, oftentimes that doesn't sound like much. It's like, oh, well, that community, clearly they're struggling in this way. Like right now in the communities we're working with post-disaster, I can point out a bunch of weaknesses. But then I talk to people at the state or I talk to agencies who honestly never get out in communities. They're doing all of their work in an office. They don't have that same intuitive sense of, like, where are the weaknesses in that community? And I think that planners have that role and they can communicate that to the folks who control a lot of the resources that we rely on. Probably, what Burby said a long time ago about, folks, Greg just read this in my class, his great article on why participation matters for plans. We've known for a long time that the wider the participation in a planning process, not only do the plans turn out higher quality, but also they tend to be implemented more often. He talks about how planners, that's probably our most powerful role, is that we don't have much political power, but we oftentimes determine who is at the table. Like we invite people, we bring stakeholders together. We're the ones who oftentimes are bringing the group, and that's a huge amount of power without being political. And so I think this idea of resilience is always expanding the participation. Planners play a pretty key role in that. I think that by providing that information to local leadership and providing the sort of being able to provide good, solid data and information, local leaders are much more free to be flexible. I think that oftentimes inflexibility is out of fear rather than out of, and so planners bring that kind of information that allow local leaders to feel confident in making some tough decisions. That's happening right now in several communities around the state where local leaders are, some of them are somewhat hamstrung because they're making decisions out of fear, but others have been empowered to make some pretty, clear statements on, we are going to not rebuild in this area. We're going to make this, we're going to make the tough political choice and not rebuild certain private property even though people really want it. And that's a pretty ambitious in some ways. It's the kind of decision that for resilience we have to make, but for politically it's sort of toxic. And I think that they've been empowered by planners who are giving them good information and making them confident that the broader public supports those decisions, even if some loud voices do not. I think we help really foster relationships between a lot of different kinds of people, and especially we foster relationships horizontally and vertically. That's something that not a lot of professions do. We can talk to folks at a local level and attend meetings, but also then talk to the state folks and tell them what's going on, and that's something that we should not undervalue in terms of how important that is for the entire resilience concept. And then finally, I think planners tend to talk to each other. We come to talks like this and have conversations, and that's a really important part of continuing to learn. We have to, the great thing about planning is that no one has any idea what it is, and so neither do we. And so it's kind of everything, and so we're forced to get together every once in a while and talk about it. And so it's not like, oh, I do this one thing, and I never need to talk to anyone about it again because I'm good at it. Planners are sort of always in a continual state of identity crisis, and that's great because for resilience, the conversations that emerge from that are pretty key. So that's all I have, and then Ann is going to lead a discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. We've gotten a lot of good food for thought and kind of new perspectives on stuff we've all been grappling with, especially here in Colorado for the last years. We're going to shift into the next kind of 15 minutes here to some discussion. And for the folks that are calling in, we invite you to type in your questions, and we will then interject those throughout the conversation here in the room. And then those in the room, if you can, we can pass around one of these mics and that you can speak into it so people can hear better. So, yeah. So, this last slide that Andy kind of wrapped up the topic of the day, which is, why are planners critical for achieving resilience? I'm curious, starting there, if you guys had any other additional thoughts to add to the list that Andy came up about, what is so critical about what we do that can shape our communities so that, in fact, the next time around, we're not suffering as much from the next disaster. Is there anything else that you guys wanted to add to that about the role of planners? One thing that came to my mind real quick was just the land use piece of it. Well, if people are building in floodplains, then, that can be challenging. So, taking a hard look at what are your land use regulations and some of those issues. To me, that's a kind of a unique role to planners, so we should own that and figure out how to have those conversations in our communities. Anybody else? Tom, were you?
Yeah, I was just going to...
Could somebody pass that to Tom? And maybe state your name and where you work before you speak. And I'm sorry, my name's Ann Miller, and I work with the Department of Local Affairs in Colorado.
I'm Tom Rounds with FEMA Community Planning, and I was going to comment similar to what you were saying, that the planners, the community planners, they know the people, they know the strengths and weaknesses, the vulnerabilities in those towns. So they should be part of that conversation as well, and recognizing that starting the conversation is maybe the hardest part. And we're out there, speaking with the elected officials and people in the neighborhoods and the business owners. So it's a great opportunity to further the discussion.
Julie, I know you do trainings on this.
Well, I was just going to say, I think planners, they jump in when there's a big disaster during the recovery, and it's all really sexy and exciting. But planners are not involved in these issues the way we all should be on the day-to-day during peacetime and in the pre-disaster timeline. And they're, because I think that the problem with emergency managers working so much on risk reduction issues is, I think they reach out to planners. From what I hear from them, they're really, planners don't show up at their meetings. They don't think it's their job. They're not involved. And APA, I think, has done a great job in trying to get resources out to planners, but it hasn't been a role that community planners have really taken on as to be part of the sort of mitigation discussion. And maybe we could call it resilience now, and it'll, get more interest. But it's been like pulling teeth to get planners more involved.
And why do you think that is? The capacity?
I think they don't learn about it in planning school, for one thing. But now we're doing better, right? I mean, I did because I went to school in Oregon. But, I think a lot of programs don't do it. And they're just really busy. You've got a lot of other priorities, just like the elected officials do.
Could you please pass?
My name is Olivia Simpson. I'm with the State Office of Emergency Management and a planner. And I think one of the things, and I've worked in developing world contexts, especially where there's weak governance and where the informal systems are actually the strongest systems that exist, like the American Samoa example that Andy gave, but also just working in the communities here in Colorado is helping the communities articulate and kind of almost formalize their systems and to help them leverage their systems. So helping them understand through language, writing down in planning language what systems are working for them, identifying their vulnerabilities, and talking them through that so they can kind of understand their own weaknesses. That's always been a really amazing process. So, for example, the American Samoa example that you had, that they didn't know that their social networks were actually their biggest asset until this happened, at which point they could start to strengthen those, and they could also get resources to those systems so they could get trainings to the local people and things like that. And I think that's a really I think that's a really fascinating, gratifying part of being a planner in disaster, and one that planners can do, because you can spend time with the local communities to understand, but also help them do that translation that is often required to get resources down to the local level. So, thanks.
Okay, perfect.
I have this one. I think that's a really good, I think, it's funny, going back to your point, I've heard the exact opposite from planners, that emergency managers treat them like they don't know what they're talking about, that it's their area of expertise and they should have nothing to, it's interesting to hear just from from the other side. I've heard that. I haven't talked to nearly enough people to know what's the truth, but.
I go to planning conferences and I talk to, a lot of them don't really know what's going on.
Right. Yeah. But where the breakdown is, it's interesting, but it's clearly a big problem. And I think who writes the plans, if you even just looking at that reveals it's a big problem. Olivia, I think what you said is really important. I think that it's interesting. It's not only there's the person at Colorado. I'm forgetting her name all of a sudden. She's a disaster anthropologist who talks about sort of disaster ambassadors. And it's this critical role that person plays in the community who not only has this sort of respect and knowledge about local people, especially marginalized communities, but then can also speak the language of the bureaucracy. And those are the people that really, in a lot of disasters, are the ones who make or break the resilience of a community, because they're the ones, communities that have that person are able to articulate what is going on with them and able to access all the bureaucratic resources. But if they don't have that person, they oftentimes are sort of either silent or very different. They are not successful in that. And I think it's similar. It's like planners can, in some small way, play that role because they're able, at least on an everyday basis, planners tend to be much closer to the ground than folks who are managing large grant programs, state grant programs, federal grant programs, or the kind of nationwide resources. And I think, again, that ambassador role can be, speaking both languages is really important.
Another question that I would pose to the group, and especially some of the folks who are calling in that weren't able to come because they're doing the important work in their communities right now. We appreciate you taking the time to call in. But, we've talked a lot about, or Andy's talked about, shining a light on our history as well as what's our experience right now, and we're constantly learning and evaluating, okay, what do we need to be doing now so that we're ready to deal with not only the current but the future events. So I thought it'd be helpful to just take a minute to reflect on, okay, well what are some of the successes building on the capacities that communities have had here in Colorado dealing with different disasters recently, as well as what are some of the challenges that you're still struggling with and grappling with as planners, dealing with the resiliency and hazard planning. So it might be a little difficult, but I'd encourage folks that are calling in to just give it a little thought and type in your thoughts, and Waverly will share that. But I'll also put it out to the group here. What have you observed from your experience working with communities here in Colorado about successes as well as some still kind of pretty intense challenges that communities are facing? Any highlights from kind of telling the story of resilience in Colorado here?
Well, from the phone, Andy from DOLA gives a suggestion. She says we should take our community emergency managers to lunch and take the time to understand what they do, who they work with, etc. Start from that point, and then we can talk about common objectives and opportunities to collaborate.
Lunch is good, yeah. It'll make some friends, that's good. Other thoughts about kind of what we're seeing here in Colorado, successes, challenges? I'm curious from the students who worked really closely in Lyons, I'm wondering if, you had any observations of maybe what impressed you about that community from what you learned, if there's anything highlights that you would want to shed on that. Any observations, not to put you on the spot, but there are several of you, so you can look at each other nervously. Okay.
I'll add something. I think in terms of working through the Lyons Recovery Action Planning process, they did do a great job of trying to work sustainability into their recovery planning process. But sometimes it felt as though there was a small group of folks incorporating that into the broader action plan. And I think it was something that was a community priority, but perhaps looking forward to other recovery action plans, how resiliency and sustainability can be integrated in a way that all community members are exposed to that.
And I think part of that, the interesting experience, like different recovery planning processes, in some ways can be, it's almost like it's finding the balance between community leadership and outside expertise. And I think there's a really good example. I mean, similar to New Orleans. In New Orleans, there were several sort of initial planning processes that were too top-down, too expert-driven. They completely failed. The city rejected them. The city was kind of set back several years because of that. And finally, they had a process that worked pretty well for most folks, not all. But they found a good balance between like leadership at the top and participation from the bottom, where they were able to inject mitigation and discussions of mitigation more intentionally throughout the process than you would if you just kind of let the citizens lead the process. And I feel like that's kind of what happened maybe with Lions a bit, is that there wasn't enough of an interjection of a voice of planners who had experience and were able to speak that into the process. And that's an interesting, I've been thinking about that recently, who serves that role, and I don't think we have the right system in place. A lot of planners who work from outside a community consider themselves to be so subservient to the community that we should just listen and we should be sounding boards for community. I think there has to be an advocacy role. They have to be advocating, if not, they're not pushing them, but they're certainly, bringing a certain voice to bear. And I think that's something that's been missing in purely resident-driven processes. You end up with a plan that doesn't very strongly take advantage of some of the mitigation options they might have done. So
I think that's another kind of reminder to planners that it is kind of your professional responsibility to kind of take on, okay, that wear the hazard planning hat so that you're not in a crisis and reacting after an event and not prepared to play that leadership role. So I think it's really easy to go, oh, yeah, I have to be honest, I didn't really pay attention and go to sessions on hazards planning, and I was like, oh, that doesn't sound very exciting. I just couldn't relate to it, and that was a mistake, Now it's like I'm having to deal with it and crash course. So I've learned a lot, but it would have been nice to have it integrated and really considered, okay, part of the basic repertoire of every planner, some knowledge and skills that you must have if you're a master's or whatever level of training. Yes.
Question kind of building off that. I'm an experience with the Colorado Energy Office, and I'm just curious if in any of the case studies that you've seen following a disaster that occurred, have you seen planners taking advantage of the opportunity to incorporate innovative technologies such as energy efficiency, renewable energy into their planning efforts, an attempt to be more sustainable and resilient in the long run?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's the case that everyone's talking about right now, which is Greensburg. Kansas did a pretty, the most LEED certified buildings of any city in the country. I think it is, or the largest per capita of any city in the country now. But I think on a smaller scale, I mean, there are good examples of that, especially, again, where you focus on that sort of benefit. Like right now, there's a conversation in Colorado about how to rebuild affordable housing, and a lot of the authorities are actually using that as part of their cost estimation, is how you can reduce utility costs and build in the sort of, how do you, in Colorado, the average profile of a person who lost their home in the flood was something between 30 and 50% of area median income. That's pretty difficult to rebuild to for any community. So one of the things we're grappling with in our class and with the town is like, how do you build units in small towns that don't typically have multifamily or large apartment buildings? How do you build, and a big part of that is building in those kind of ideas. And so it's not so much about we should be rebuilding housing that's all energy efficient. It's rather, how can we build a housing that's the most cost effective? And I think those worlds are starting to collide a little bit. But I think Greensburg is probably, from an inspirational standpoint, probably the one I've seen the most, as well as some of the communities along the Mississippi coast that are doing a lot of very unique things. Sure.
Yeah.
I just have another one, a good question from Andy on the webinar. So she asks, why aren't more communities integrating hazards into their comprehensive plans? what makes this so difficult or uncommon?
That's a really good question. I think part of it's the Hazard Mitigation Act created in some sense a cottage industry for hazard mitigation plans to be separate from comprehensive plans, and therefore they became the sort of either the product of very specialized consultants that come in and do those, and then they're separate from the comprehensive plan. I also think that it's not a, like Anne mentioned too earlier, I don't think it's not a role that planners have always played, and I think for a long time disaster mitigation was about engineering and to some sense floodplain management and a little bit of, we've known for 50 years that land use planning is the single most effective tool we have for hazard mitigation, but we've also learned for 50 years that it's the single least effective thing we can do as planners because it involves politics and property rights and those sorts of things. And so, I don't know, that's a really good question. I think if you could figure that out, I think it's changing though. I think more cities are starting to, rather than thinking about hazard mitigation or disaster management or emergency management as a separate thing, it's New York City is leading the way a lot, for example, right now, in their sort of comp plan revisions and how they're building long-term offices that are actually thinking about these issues. But I think some people in the room would probably have a better perspective on that than I would, though.
Okay. Well, we maybe have time for one more comment. Julie, did you want to chime in real quick? Yeah.
National Renewable Energy Lab in Golden has like specific programs just to help with, and I don't know if you know those folks over there that do it, but Tom and I worked with them in New Jersey. They came out and were working with the state on what kind of programs would work in the recovery program.
I think I was just going to say, I mentioned the Gulf Coast, but David Perks from the Gulf Coast Community Design Center was here recently for the APA-supported community planning assistance team. Him and other architects in the Gulf Coast have done some pretty remarkable things in terms of building materials and materials design and use of different kinds of architectural and design techniques to build, resilient. I mean, if you go look at some of those examples, especially the use of vernacular architecture that's much more appropriate to hazards than sort of modern, cheap plywood, slab ground grade kind of construction, some of that work is really inspiring, and at the end of the day, they find out it's actually more cost-effective when you start factoring in the lowered insurance costs, the different sort of features they've built in have actually made the building less expensive, not more than the sort of cheap mass-produced housing we often see.
Okay. Well, I want to thank everyone again for participating, and thank Andy especially for presenting. This was meant to kind of provide an overview and start the conversation so that we can delve deeper into some of the subject matters that were raised today. And we are going to be sending out a post-event evaluation for everybody to fill out, and it does include some questions about what additional trainings are you interested in participating in or you think are needed for your community on this topic. So we would love to hear your feedback and look for more announcements about future trainings. And if you're interested in partnering with us on that, we, for APA Colorado, are very interested in kind of broadening out our partnerships to offer these kinds of trainings. Also, we'll be sending out information about the credits for AICP, and those are still pending, but we expect to hear. So thank you again, and if you're interested in learning more about the APA Colorado, the different committees, including the Sustainability Committee and the Student Chapter, you can go on the website. We have monthly meetings, so we encourage you to stay involved. Thank you again.